Life is full of unseen battles, battles of fear, doubt, and spiritual warfare. But what if I told you that no curse, no darkness, and no enemy can stand against the power that surrounds you? In this message, God speaks directly to your heart, reminding you that His love, His protection, and His divine plan are unshakable. You are not alone. You were chosen to walk in victory, covered by a supernatural shield that no evil can penetrate. Stay with me until the end of this powerful message, because today your faith will be strengthened, your spirit will be renewed, and your life will be transformed. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more inspiring messages like this. Now, let's begin. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the trees. James sat alone on his porch, staring at the vast sky, his heart weighed down by invisible burdens. Life had been relentless, one hardship after another, a constant battle that left him questioning if he was truly protected, if God really saw him. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm his soul. "God," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, "do you hear me? Do you even care?" At that moment, a deep peace settled over him, as if the wind itself carried an answer. His mind drifted to the words his grandmother used to say, words pulled straight from the Bible. "No weapon formed against you shall prosper." Isaiah 54:17. But did he truly believe it? James's life had not been easy. He had lost his job months ago, his marriage was crumbling, and now even his faith felt like it was slipping through his fingers. The weight of rejection and failure pressed down on him like a curse he couldn't shake. As he sat there, his thoughts darkened, replaying every disappointment, every betrayal. It was then that a voice, gentle yet powerful, rose within his heart. "My child, you are covered. No curse, no darkness, no force of evil can harm you if you remain in me. My protection surrounds you like an unbreakable shield." The words weren't audible, yet they echoed with a force that shook his spirit. A warmth spread through him, pushing back the cold fear that had gripped him for so long. He suddenly remembered the story of Job, a man who had lost everything yet remained steadfast in his faith. The enemy had tried to break him, but God's protection was never removed. Even in the darkest of times, Job had not been abandoned. James's breath caught as realization settled in. His struggles were real, but so was God's promise. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, and for the first time in a long while, James felt something shift inside him. "Do not fear the weapons formed against you, for they will not prevail. Do not tremble before the storms, for I am the one who calms them. I have called you to walk in victory, not in defeat." Tears welled in James's eyes. Could it be that all along he had been fighting a battle that was already won? That the weight he carried was never his to bear? He stood, lifting his face to the sky, and whispered, "I believe, Lord. I believe." As the night stretched on, something within James changed. The struggles didn't disappear overnight, but his heart was no longer imprisoned by fear. He knew now he was covered. No curse could touch him. No darkness could consume him. For the first time in months, he walked back inside with a sense of peace, a shield of divine strength surrounding him. Little did he know, his journey was just beginning. James woke up the next morning feeling lighter than he had in months. The weight that had been pressing on his chest seemed to have lifted, even if just slightly. But as the hours passed, the familiar worries crept back in. His phone buzzed. Another rejection email. He sighed, rubbing his forehead. "God, I thought you were with me. Why does it still feel like everything is falling apart?" The doubt hit harder than he expected. He had believed the night before. He had felt God's presence. But now he was standing in the middle of his messy reality, and nothing had changed. His best friend, Michael, called just as James was about to sink into another spiral of frustration. "Man, you gotta get out of that house," Michael said. "Come with me to church tonight. Just come." James hesitated. He hadn't stepped into a church in years, but something in Michael's voice, steady, persistent, made him agree. That evening, James sat quietly in the back of the church. The music swelled around him, voices lifting in worship. He wanted to feel something, anything, but his heart was numb. Then the pastor stepped forward. His voice was calm, yet powerful. "Some of you feel like you're at the breaking point, like you've prayed, you've believed, and still, nothing is changing." James's breath caught. "You wonder if God has forgotten you. You wonder if the promises in the Bible are for everyone but you. But I'm here to tell you, God sees you. He has not abandoned you. His timing is perfect, even when you don't understand it." A lump formed in James's throat. He clenched his fists, holding back tears. Isaiah 41:10 says, "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." The words hit him like a wave, knocking down the walls he had built around his heart. For so long, James had believed that his struggles meant God had turned his back on him, that he had to prove himself worthy of blessings. But in that moment, he realized God's love was never based on his success or failure. It had always been constant, unshaken. Tears slipped down his face. Michael, sitting beside him, placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone, man. You never were." James nodded, unable to speak. Something deep inside him cracked open. A flood of emotions, grief, exhaustion, relief, washed over him. He closed his eyes and whispered, "I surrender, Lord. I don't know what you're doing, but I trust you." And for the first time in years, he truly meant it. Little did he know, this moment, this breaking point, was only the beginning of something far greater than he could imagine. James sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He was parked outside the office building where Michael had helped him secure an interview. His heart pounded. What if I mess this up? The thought echoed in his mind, relentless and unforgiving. He had failed before, lost jobs, broken relationships, made mistakes that still haunted him. What if this was just another cycle? Another moment where he stepped forward, only to fall again. He inhaled sharply, staring at the glass doors ahead. "Lord, I don't know if I can do this." At that moment, his phone buzzed. A message from Michael. "You got this. Remember, you're not walking alone. For we walk by faith, not by sight." 2 Corinthians 5:7. James swallowed hard. He had heard that verse before, but now, in this moment, it felt different. Walking by faith. It wasn't about having all the answers. It wasn't about knowing the outcome. It was about taking a step, even when the path ahead was unclear. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Okay, God. I trust you." With a deep breath, he opened the car door and stepped out. The interview went better than he expected. Sitting across from the hiring manager, James felt something he hadn't in a long time. Confidence. Not the false kind, not the kind that came from pretending he had it all together, but a quiet assurance that he was exactly where he needed to be. They asked about his past work experience. He answered honestly. They asked why he had gaps in his employment history. He didn't make excuses, and when they asked what motivated him, he paused, then said, "I'm learning to trust that every challenge I've faced has prepared me for what's next." The hiring manager studied him for a moment, then smiled. "I like that answer." An hour later, he walked out of the building with something he hadn't expected, a job offer. He sat in his car, staring at the paper in his hands. The same hands that had been trembling with fear earlier that morning were now steady. "Thank you, Lord." It wasn't just about the job. It was about knowing that he didn't have to figure everything out alone. That when he took a step, God met him there. That evening, James met Michael for dinner. "I knew you'd get it," Michael grinned. James shook his head, laughing. "Man, I didn't. But I think that's the whole point." Michael raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" James exhaled. "I keep waiting for everything to make sense before I move forward. But maybe faith isn't about having everything figured out. Maybe it's about trusting that God is guiding me, even when I don't see it." Michael nodded. "Sounds like you're finally starting to believe what I've been telling you." James chuckled. "Maybe, but I think I needed to hear it from someone bigger than you." Michael laughed, raising his glass. "To new beginnings." James clinked his glass against his friend's. "To walking by faith." For the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of what came next. The first few weeks at his new job were better than James expected. He was adjusting well, his co-workers were welcoming, and for the first time in months, he felt like things were finally moving in the right direction. But then, the old fears crept back in. Late one evening, after finishing his shift, James sat in his car staring blankly at his phone. His bank app was open, and the numbers on the screen made his stomach tighten. Even with his new job, the overdue bills were piling up faster than he could pay them. "I thought things were supposed to get better, Lord," he whispered, running a hand through his hair. The weight of responsibility felt crushing. He had been so hopeful, so sure that God was leading him. But now, reality was hitting hard, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could hold on. His phone buzzed, a text from Michael. "Hey man, been thinking about you. How's everything going?" James hesitated before typing back. "Not great. Still struggling. Feels like no matter how hard I try, I can't get ahead." Michael's response came almost instantly. "God didn't bring you this far just to leave you, bro. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Psalm 34:18. "Keep going. You're not alone." James sighed, staring at the words on his screen. He wanted to believe that. He really did. But faith wasn't easy when life felt like a never-ending uphill battle. The next morning, James sat in the break room, staring into his cup of coffee, lost in thought. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders," a voice said. He looked up to see an older man, maybe in his late 50s, sitting across from him. His name tag read Thomas, someone James had seen around but never really spoken to. James forced a small smile. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind." Thomas nodded knowingly. "I've been there, more times than I can count." Something about the man's presence was comforting. He had that kind of wisdom in his eyes that only came from walking through storms and surviving. "I don't mean to pry," Thomas continued, "but I've learned something over the years. Sometimes when it feels like everything is falling apart, that's when God is actually putting things together." James looked up, his heart stirring. "I used to think faith meant everything would go smoothly," Thomas said. "But faith isn't about avoiding struggles. It's about trusting that God is still in control, even in the middle of them." James swallowed hard. Those words hit deep. Thomas leaned back, taking a sip of his coffee. "Remember what Jesus told Peter when he was sinking? 'You of little faith, why did you doubt?'" He chuckled softly. Sometimes we forget that Peter was already walking on water before he sank. He only started to drown when he took his eyes off Jesus. James exhaled slowly. Had he been doing the same thing? Letting the waves of stress pull him under instead of keeping his eyes on God? Thomas smiled. "Don't let doubt win, son. God's still got you." For the rest of the day, those words stayed with James. That night, as he sat on his porch, he looked up at the sky. It was vast, endless, full of possibilities he couldn't yet see. And for the first time in days, he didn't just pray. He believed. "I won't take my eyes off you, Lord." Because even when faith was tested, he now understood. God was still in control. The days that followed were a mix of hope and struggle. James clung to the words Thomas had shared with him, that faith wasn't about avoiding the storm, but trusting God in the middle of it. But faith, James was learning, didn't make life easier overnight. One evening, after another long shift, he walked into his apartment only to find an eviction notice taped to his door. His heart sank. This can't be happening. His hands trembled as he tore the paper from the door. He had been trying, working hard, cutting back, doing everything he could. But it wasn't enough. He stepped inside, sinking onto the couch, his mind racing. He had 2 weeks to come up with the rent, or he'd have nowhere to go. The old fear returned, the same fear that had gripped him for months. God, I thought you were leading me. I thought you were making a way. But no answer came. James clenched his fists. He wanted to trust. He wanted to believe. But how could he when everything kept falling apart? His phone buzzed. Michael again. Hey man, I feel like I need to remind you of this. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. Isaiah 43:2. Don't let this break you. You're being refined. James exhaled sharply, reading the verse over and over. Refined. He knew the story of how gold was purified through fire. The intense heat burned away the impurities, leaving only what was valuable. Was that what God was doing? The next day at work, James struggled to focus. The eviction notice weighed heavy on him. At lunch, he found himself back in the break room, and once again, Thomas was there. Rough day? The older man asked, setting his coffee down. James let out a dry laugh. You could say that. Thomas studied him for a moment. You know, I once lost everything. James looked up. Everything? Thomas nodded. House, job, marriage. I hit rock bottom. James swallowed hard. How did you get through it? Thomas leaned back, a distant look in his eyes. I stopped fighting the fire. James frowned. What do you mean? Thomas smiled slightly. I spent so much time asking God to take away the struggle, to stop the pain. But one day, I realized something. Sometimes the fire isn't there to destroy us. It's there to refine us, to shape us into who we're meant to be. He tapped his fingers on the table. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they weren't saved from the fire. They were saved in the fire. God didn't keep them from being thrown in, but he walked with them through it. James nodded slowly. Thomas continued. I don't know what you're facing, but I do know this. If you let God refine you instead of resisting the process, you'll come out stronger. It won't break you. It'll shape you. James sat with those words long after Thomas had left the room. Maybe this season wasn't about punishment. Maybe it was preparation. That night, he sat on his porch again, staring at the sky. Lord, I don't understand everything you're doing, but I won't fight the fire anymore. If this is how you're shaping me, then I trust you. For the first time, he didn't just pray those words. He surrendered to them. And as he did, a quiet peace settled over him. The fire wasn't over. The battle wasn't won. But he wasn't afraid anymore. Because now, he knew God was in the fire with him. James woke up the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose. The storm hadn't passed, but something inside him had shifted. He wasn't fighting against it anymore. He was walking through it, trusting that God was with him. But faith, as he was learning, wasn't just about believing. It was about action. He grabbed his laptop and started making phone calls, anything to find a way to cover his rent before the eviction deadline. He reached out to old contacts, checked job listings, even considered side gigs. Nothing seemed to work. By noon, frustration began creeping in again. His phone battery was nearly dead, and he had nothing to show for his efforts. God, I'm doing everything I can. Where are you? The silence was heavy. Just then, his phone buzzed. A call from an unknown number. He hesitated, but answered. "Is this James Walker?" a voice asked. "Yes, who's this?" "This is Mr. Adams from Trinity Community Services. You applied for financial assistance a few months ago, but we didn't have the funding at the time. Well, I have some good news. The program has reopened and we have an emergency grant available. It won't cover everything, but it'll buy you some time." James's heart pounded. "Wait, you're saying?" "Yes, we can cover 1 month's rent. If you can come in today to sign the paperwork, we'll process it immediately." For a moment, James couldn't breathe. He had forgotten all about that application. But God hadn't. "Sir?" the man asked. James cleared his throat. Yes, I'll be there." That afternoon, as he walked out of the office with the paperwork in hand, he couldn't stop the tears from welling up. "I see you, Lord. I see what you're doing." He wasn't out of the storm, but today, this moment, was proof that he wasn't forgotten. Later that evening, James met up with Michael, needing to share what had happened. "Dude, that's incredible," Michael said, shaking his head in amazement. "I told you, God doesn't leave his people stranded." James exhaled, staring at his coffee. "I almost gave up, man. I almost let fear convince me that God wasn't listening." Michael nodded. "That's how the enemy works. Fear makes you forget every time God has come through for you before." James thought back to all the times he had doubted, every moment he had questioned if God was still working, and yet God had never stopped moving. Michael grinned. "You know what this reminds me of? Paul and Silas in prison. They were locked up, chained, no way out. But what did they do?" James smirked. "They started worshiping." Michael snapped his fingers. "Exactly. And in the middle of their praise, God sent an earthquake and broke their chains. You want to know why? Because no prison, no struggle, no circumstance is greater than our God." James leaned back, letting the words sink in. He had spent so much time feeling trapped by fear, by circumstances, by the weight of his struggles. But tonight, something felt different. Tonight, the chains were breaking. As he walked home under the glow of the streetlights, he whispered, "Lord, I won't just trust you in the blessing. I'll trust you in the waiting." And as he stepped through his front door for the first time in a long time, he felt completely free. The following days felt different. James still had challenges. His bills weren't magically erased and his struggles weren't over. But something inside him had shifted. He no longer felt like he was barely holding on. There was a strength in him now, a faith that wasn't shaken by circumstances. One evening, he sat on his porch, scrolling through his phone. A video popped up, a sermon about the power of praise in the middle of the storm. "Praise isn't just for when things are good," the preacher said. "Praise is the weapon God has given us when things look impossible." When Jehoshaphat faced an army he couldn't defeat, what did he do? He sent worshipers ahead of the battle. And what happened? The enemy destroyed itself before Israel even lifted a sword. James leaned back, letting the words sink in. He had spent so much time waiting for the battle to end before praising God. What if he started praising now? That Sunday, for the first time in years, James went back to church. As the worship music filled the room, he felt something stir deep inside him. He watched as people lifted their hands in surrender, voices rising with gratitude, some with tears streaming down their faces. They weren't waiting for the storm to pass. They were worshiping in the middle of it. James swallowed hard. Could he do that? Could he lift his hands and praise even when life still felt uncertain? Slowly, almost hesitantly, he closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Lord." Not for the struggles, but for his presence in the middle of them, for the ways he had provided, for the peace he had given, for the battles he was already fighting on James's behalf. Some he could see, and some he couldn't. As the words left his lips, something broke inside him. Tears fell freely, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't hold them back. because in that moment, he understood. Faith wasn't about waiting to see the victory before worshiping. Faith was praising before the victory even arrived. After the service, Michael found him outside. "You okay?" James laughed through his tears. "Yeah, actually, I think I'm better than okay." Michael smiled. "I saw you." James wiped his face. "Saw what?" "You lifted your hands." James exhaled. "Yeah, I think I finally get it, man. Worship isn't about what's happening around me. It's about who God is, no matter what's happening." Michael grinned. "Now you're preaching." James chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, just learning." Michael patted his back. "Keep learning and keep praising. That's how you fight." James nodded, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Because now, he wasn't just surviving the storm, he was worshiping through it. The following week felt different. James wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. There was still uncertainty, still challenges, but something in his spirit had changed. Every morning, before stepping out of his apartment, he whispered, "Thank you, Lord." Not because everything was perfect, but because he now understood that praise wasn't based on circumstances. It was based on who God is. But James was about to learn something even greater. When you trust God fully, He starts opening doors in ways you never expect. One afternoon at work, James was focused on a project when Thomas, the older co-worker who had given him wisdom before, stopped by his desk. "Got a minute?" Thomas asked. James looked up and nodded. "Of course." Thomas sat down across from him, studying him for a moment before speaking. "I've been watching you, son. You've changed. There's a piece in you now that wasn't there before." James exhaled, a small smile forming. "Yeah, God's been working on me." Thomas nodded. "I can see that, and I think it's time you step into something bigger." James furrowed his brow. "What do you mean?" Thomas leaned forward. "There's an opening for a management position. It's more responsibility, but it's also better pay. Enough to finally get ahead. I think you should apply." James froze. He wasn't expecting this. "Me? A management position?" Thomas chuckled. "Why not? You're hardworking, you've got integrity, and I see leadership in you. You might not see it in yourself yet, but I do." James swallowed hard. Leadership. He had spent so much of his life doubting himself, feeling unqualified. But then he remembered something. God doesn't call the qualified. He qualifies the called. Moses had doubted himself. Gideon had doubted himself. Even Peter, who walked on water, had struggled with fear. But God had used them anyway. Could it be that God was doing the same with him? James took a deep breath. "I'll think about it." Thomas smiled knowingly. "Do more than think about it. Pray about it." James nodded. "I will." That night, James sat on his porch, staring at the stars. "Lord, is this you? Are you opening this door? Because if you are, I don't want fear to stop me." A gentle breeze blew past him, and in his heart, he felt a quiet whisper, "I am with you." The same words God had spoken to Joshua before leading him into the promised land. James inhaled deeply. He had spent so much of his life waiting for the right time. But maybe the right time wasn't about circumstances. It was about obedience. The next morning, James walked into work with a decision already made in his heart. He found Thomas and met his gaze. "I'm going to apply." A slow smile spread across Thomas's face. "Good. I think you'll be surprised by what God does next." James didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to walk through the door God was opening. James sat in the conference room, his palms resting flat on the table. The air buzzed with quiet anticipation as the hiring manager flipped through his application. He had prayed about this moment. He had surrendered his fears. Now, he was here, waiting for an answer. The manager looked up and smiled. "James, we're impressed. You've shown leadership, persistence, and a heart for the work you do. We believe you'd be a great fit for this position." James held his breath. "We'd like to offer you the role." For a moment, he couldn't speak. A lump formed in his throat as he processed the words. A few months ago, he had been drowning in doubt, paralyzed by fear. Now, he was stepping into something greater than he ever expected. God had done what he promised. James extended his hand. "Thank you. I won't take this for granted." As he walked out of the room, a wave of emotions hit him. Gratitude, relief, awe. God hadn't just answered his prayers. He had exceeded them. That evening, James met up with Michael and Thomas at a small diner. "So, how'd it go?" Michael asked, sipping his coffee. James exhaled, shaking his head in disbelief. "I got it." Michael grinned. "Of course you did." Thomas nodded. "God's been preparing you for this. You just needed to believe it." James stirred his drink, thinking about the journey he had been on. The fear, the doubt, the refining fire. Every moment had led to this. "I used to think faith was about waiting for everything to be perfect," he admitted. "But now I get it. It's about trusting God before you see the outcome." Michael leaned back. "And?" James smiled. "And he never fails." Thomas lifted his glass. "To new beginnings." James and Michael raised theirs. "To walking in victory." That night, James stood on his porch looking up at the stars. "Lord, thank you. Not just for the blessings, but for the process. For every trial that shaped me, for every moment you carried me. I see it now. I was never alone." The wind whispered through the trees, and in his heart, he felt the quiet assurance he had longed for. This wasn't just the end of a season, it was the beginning of something greater. And as he stepped inside, he knew this was only the start of the story God was writing in his life.